Uh-oh. Did I? Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, it's so great to be here. So obviously, I have a short introduction about me as well. I've done a bunch of stuff. What is probably more relevant to this talk is that I've been in the CSS working group for over 10 years at this point. I edit a bunch of CSS specs. So if you have any questions about how all of this works, even if it's unrelated to this topic, feel free to ask me after the talk, or even like submit a question. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So the idea for this talk came to me 2 years ago when I was working on the CSS chapter of the Web Almanac. And we looked specifically at how people were using CSS variables in the wild. And what we saw was, and as I suspected, that most uses of CSS variables in the wild are still fairly basic. Either they're used as constants, like a depth of 0, or they're used, or they just refer to other constants, essentially, like variables that are just set to a fixed value. And also, most of them, like the vast majority of CSS variable declarations are on the root element, essentially making them global, not taking any advantage of their dynamic scoping. So basically, we got these amazing dynamically scoped, kick-ass reactive variables, and we're still treating them as glorified constants. And I mean, this is nobody's fault, really. This is how they've been promoted by everyone in the industry. It's like, now you can have your colors in a variable. Now you can have your fonts in a variable. But like, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that custom properties can do for us. So hence this talk was born. So I call today's talk a story in 3 acts because we're going to see it's going to have 3 separate sections, 3 separate components that each are going to teach us a few things about custom properties that you may not know. So the first one is called the outlined button. The second one is called the glossy button. And yes, I think buttons are, because they're the most essential type of component, and there's still so much that buttons can teach us. The third one is called the bar chart. And then, obviously, there's going to be a conclusion about how this all comes together and what does it all teach us. And I will use component a lot in this talk, but I use it fairly liberally. I'm not referring to a component in the sense of like a React component or a Vue component. Like, a component is basically a reusable blob of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it can be a React component, or it could be a Vue component, or it could be a component from any other framework. It could be a web component, or it could just be a reusable blob of HTML that you copy and paste around. It's still a component, for at least the purposes of this talk. So without further ado, the first act is going to remind us some things that you might already know, and also teach us some best practices. But it's sort of more laying down the fundamentals. So, and it starts with this very simple code example. It's a button with a style to look outlined, and when you hover over it, the entire background goes its primary color. And right now, it's not using any variables, as you can see. It's just having a lot of repetitive code. And as you know, you can use a variable to reduce this repetition. So we're going to do just that. We're going to use a color variable. And then, of course, the variation, instead of involving 2 rules and 4 declarations, now it just becomes a single variation. And of course, it means that we can now create variations through inline styles, or we could even create dynamic variations through JavaScript. So far, it's pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. I'm sure you've done that sort of thing many times. And yes, I'm using an inline event handler here. Like, deal with it. It's a demo. Like, all the good coding practices can go out of the window if it's a demo, right? And now, every time I click on it, I get a different accent color for it. Again, pretty normal stuff. All right. So now, the first thing is that CSS variables are just regular properties, as you probably know, and they're actually inherited properties. So right now, we've set the fallback to be black by setting a declaration of like -- color black in our base rule, but that was problematic for a number of reasons. It meant that anyone that wanted to use this button needed to override our own rule. It also meant that they couldn't just set -- color on the root element and have it cascade down. so none of this is ideal. It's much better to use the fallback argument. However, now that we used the fallback argument, we had to repeat this value 3 times, which is not great. So what can we do? Our first thought might be, you know what, I know how to reduce duplication. I'm going to use a variable. Is this good? Does this work? Isn't this awful? Every time we use this color variable now, we have to repeat this huge thing. Imagine a whole design system using that. So what else can we do? We can use what I call pseudo-private variables. A variable that is by convention prefixed with an underscore and is basically referencing our variable with its fallback. And then we can just use underscore color everywhere where we were using dash dash color before. And it works the same, but it's much shorter. So, second takeaway, pseudo-private variables succinctly reduce feedback duplication. I mean, we can reduce feedback duplication by having a separate variable, as we saw, but then that is super long. And these are pseudo-private because there's nothing about an underscore that makes it actually private. It's just a convention. It's the same convention that JavaScript was using for like 15 years until we actually got private class fields. So it's like, to people coming from like more traditional programming languages, they might be shocked at like, what do you mean pseudo-private? Like, what? You don't have actually private things here? JavaScript did this for 15 years. We can do this in CSS. So, right now, when we hover over the button, it's completely abrupt. If we add a transition, as you know, it just animates anything it can animate, so it gives us this sort of fade. We don't want that, though. We want a different hover effect. We want the border to sort of grow inwards and have that sort of hover effect. So we were thinking, how are we going to do that? Well, you know what? We can emulate that with a box shadow. So we can go onto the hover rule and change the rule that sets the background color to the button's main color to instead be specified with a box shadow, an inset box shadow with a large spread. And now it does the hover effect we wanted. And why is this in a talk that is not about transitions? It's a talk about CSS variables. Because it highlights a very important thing that CSS variables afford us. CSS variables allow us to create a higher level styling API. Someone that is using our component and is styling it with the color variable that we introduced, that we exposed, that we documented, doesn't need to change their code when we decided to have this fancy hover effect. They can still continue using dash dash color, and our code just adapts to it, and now they get, when they update the CSS file of our button that they are using, they now get the fancy hover effect without having to change anything about their own code. Think about how this would look before CSS variables. We would have to notify anybody using this sort of CSS library that we wrote, of which this component is a part of, and tell them, you know what, if you need to update your code so that on the hover effect it uses a box shadow of this format. Like, isn't that awful? And essentially, in this way, CSS variables allow us to create a sort of CSS API. And web component libraries have already been taking advantage of that. Shoelace, which is my favorite web component library, for every component, it already lists a bunch of custom properties that it supports. Now let's go back to the previous code because I want to show you something else. Let's remove this transition to keep things a bit simple. And now let's suppose that what we wanted to have, instead of a color with a certain fixed main color, we wanted to have a rainbow variation where the button actually animates through a variety of colors. And our first thought for that might be, well, you know what? I'm going to have a color hue variable, and I'm going to animate this to go through different hues. And for debugging purposes, I'm going to make it go from 0 to 180. And the eventual intention is to make it go through the entire range of hues. And then I write an animation rule to connect my button to it. And then I notice that it doesn't quite give me the expected effect. it just gives me this abrupt change from this turquoise color to this dark red. So why does this not work? And the answer is because the browser doesn't actually know how to animate color hue. Like when the browser looks at a variable declaration, all it sees is, I'm setting this custom property to this set of tokens. It doesn't make any decisions about what this set of tokens is supposed to represent. So how can we fix that? Add property to the rescue. We can declare what the type of our variable is, and we can tell the browser, this is supposed to be a number. And then the browser suddenly knows how to animate it. And yes, all of these descriptors are required. And as you can see, now we got this nice smooth animation through all of the colors we specified. And we can put the finishing touch and make it go from 0 to 360 so that it animates smoothly through all possible hues. And as you can see, it works now. And some of you might be thinking, does that mean, because I see this initial value descriptor there, does that mean we can bake our color fallback into the color variable without having to use this pseudo-private convention? So, and before we move away from this, yes, CSS variables cannot be interpolated unless we register them with that property. And there's a JavaScript API as well. And yes, we can declare our color variable as well and bake the fallback in it. And that will work. We can go everywhere where we use this underscore color and replace it with just dash color. And this works, but it's not always a great solution. In addition to issues of browser support for add property, which is not as good as custom properties in general, it's also that add property is global. And something like dash color is a fairly generic variable name. We might not want to give it a default value of black everywhere. Like for other use cases, transparent might make more sense. One case where doing this is acceptable is in actual web components, where you declare your add property rule in a shadow tree, and then it is indeed scoped to that tree. It is not global. But yeah, I mentioned browser support is an issue, and indeed, add property has much worse browser support than CSS variables in general, which at this point, CSS variables, we can just completely rely on them. But add property, not so much. Although things look worse than they are in this chart, because these days, for better or for worse, Chrome has such a big market share that just Chrome supporting something means that like 70% of users can actually see that. So as long as you provide a fallback, and there are ways to provide a fallback, you can use that property. Just make sure you provide a fallback and that it degrades gracefully. And for something like an animation, it naturally degrades gracefully. And let's go on to the second act, the glossy button. And yes, I really like buttons. There's just so much you can show with buttons. So I pointed out that we could use CSS variables as an API, but this story is not as smooth as it might be. So at the tag, we have these guidelines for creating web platform compatible components, for people creating web components, these guidelines about what kind of API to expose. And one of them, like most of them are pretty much followed, but like one of them is don't use custom attributes for styling, like BG color. Instead, use custom properties or CSS shadow parts. Very reasonable advice, right? And yet, when you look at web component libraries in the wild, even amazing ones like Shoelace, you see that despite their custom property, their list of custom properties that they support, they do also expose quite a few presentational attributes. Like, look at this, size. There is an outline attribute to make the button outlined. If that's not presentational, I don't know what is. Actually, yeah, I do know what is. There's a pill attribute as well to make the button look like a pill. That is an actual HTML attribute. If that should not be a property, I don't know what should be. Oh, wait, maybe circles. That should also be a property, right? So why is that? These are very smart people working on Shoelace. Like, I'm not trying to criticize them. They're doing what they got to do. And the reason is that right now, there is no way there's no proper way. I'm going to show you a way, but there's no proper way in CSS that is supported by every browser to say, to create higher level custom properties, properties that take keywords, and you say, if the property is equal to this value, then apply this list of declarations. If otherwise, if it's equal to this other value, apply this list of declarations. In the near future, you will be able to do that with style container queries. You'll be able to have conditionals like these on custom property values and have whatever rules in the container query, whatever rules you want. But right now, this is in the future. Like, it's implemented in Chrome Canary, I think, behind the flag. Like, it's not ready for prime time yet at all. But I mean, if you care about making this ready for prime time, you know what you can do? Browsers are always listening to developers and want to prioritize implementing things that developers care about. And actually, there is a survey running right now, the State of CSS survey, that is going to close in 8 days, I think. And browsers are actually paying attention to the results of this survey to decide what they're going to work on next. Like, Google is actually funding this survey because they're using the results in prioritization. So if you care about getting certain features implemented, spend like 10 minutes filling it out thoughtfully, and like try to think, what are all these, what problems do I have in my daily life as a developer? Like, what could CSS do to make it easier for me to style things? Like, and write all of that in the survey. It's like one of the best ways to get your voice heard right now. And after this short thing, so while we cannot have conditionals right now, comparing CSS, comparing custom property values to arbitrary keywords, what we could do is we could have toggles where we bring in a bunch of declarations based on whether a single custom property has one value or another value. And we can also give that value nice names like on or off to make it sort of more usable in production. Like, we can control all of these different styles. Like, look at how many things are different here. Borders, backgrounds, line heights. And let me show you that basically this glossy style is applied through that property wherever I apply it on. And it's a fairly decent API, right? As you will see, the implementation is not as nice, but like what we're exposing to other people styling this component is fairly nice, I think. So how do we do that? The core of it is called space toggle, or space toggle hack, because it is essentially a hack. So it's based on the idea that space is a perfectly valid custom property value. So what is happening here? I have this fallback of a linear gradient, but because glossy is set to a space, this entire thing is replaced by a space, and I only get the background color. However, if glossy was not there at all, then I would get the fallback. And there is actually a special value I can set glossy to make it the same as if it wasn't there, initial. And then it also applies the fallback. So notice that by toggling glossy between two unrelated values, I could bring in an entire gradient. And I could use this on several different properties to bring in different types of styling. And you might be wondering, okay, this looks nice when I want to toggle on and off a certain part of a property. But what happens when I want to have different values, especially like in math? Like, I want to have a line height of 1.1 when the button is glossy and a line height of 1.5 when it's not glossy. How would we do that with space toggle? Think about it for a brief moment. This is how you do that. You basically specify the value when glossy is set to white space, the value when glossy is off, 1.5, and then the delta in a calc. Like, how do we make it 1.1? We subtract 0.4. And now it's 1.5 when glossy is off, when it's set to white space. And if I comment it out, or if I set it to initial, now the minus 0.4 gets applied because it's the fallback, and I get 1.1. So with that, I can basically have not just a value for when it's on, but also a fallback value when it's off. But that only works for numbers, obviously. And the last bit of the last piece of the puzzle, but let's summarize this for a bit. So ideally, what we want is the first syntax. And yes, we will get that eventually. We have discussions in the CSS working group about having an inline if like that. It's quite far into the future, though. The space toggle version looks like this. We have to specify the delta. And the last bit of the puzzle is how do we apply entire declarations when glossy is on, and unapply them when glossy, and like not have anything applied when glossy is off. So as you can see, this just works. Like specifying the entire value of the property in the border value in the var fallback just works. I have my border applied when glossy is not there, or if it's set to initial. But when it's set to white space, I don't get any border. And there's one thing that is different here compared to the previous examples I showed you. There's one missing piece of the puzzle for how this all works. And the missing piece is that if border was not there at all, we wouldn't get the same result. Notice, I don't know if you can see what happens when I comment border out at all. It's not that we get nothing. We get the user agent default border. So we are setting it to something when glossy is set to white space. It's not like a no-op. And this introduces a very important concept with using CSS variables that many people sort of gloss over and then are puzzled about why their code behaves differently. So let's step back for a moment. How did we used to do variables before? How did we used to do fallbacks before variables were introduced? Let's say, for example, we want to use fancy new LCH colors that can go beyond the sRGB gamut. And this is something that's coming imminently, but Chrome doesn't support it yet, and Safari does. So let's say we wanted to use an LCH color with a fallback. So we also convert it, we gamut map it, we convert it to a HSL, and we also use an HSL fallback. And that works. It gives us a more faded color in Chrome. It gives us a very bright turquoise in Safari. All very nice. And then we decide, you know what? It's 2022. Our colors should really be in variables, so we can reuse them. So we decide to have a color variable and a color fallback variable with our sort of main turquoise color. And we use it like that, and we expect to get the same result. But we don't. We get nice, bright turquoise in Safari that supports LCH colors, and we get transparent in Chrome. And why is that? The reason this happens is that when browsers read declarations that contain variables anywhere, they have to assume that depending on the value of the variable, the declaration could become valid at some point in the future. So they cannot throw it away. The parser cannot throw it away in the way that they would do with regular fallbacks. So, because, you know, even if the value that the variable has at that point doesn't make the property valid, you could set it with JavaScript in a way that makes the declaration valid. So they have to assume that any of these declarations could become valid at any point. So instead, when they read background set to color fallback, then they read background set to color, they throw away the previous declaration as if it doesn't exist, because that's what they do when they read two background declarations that both could be potentially valid. And when eventually the value of color is substituted in there, and they see that they cannot understand what this LCH color is, then this becomes invalid at computed value time. And what does this mean? Anytime a property, anytime a declaration becomes invalid at computed value time, it's basically treated as unset. Whoops, that should not have been cut off. Anyway, let's suppose this says unset. So how many of you know what the keyword unset does? Oh wow, I should have had a slide on that. So the keyword unset is a global keyword. It's valid on any property, and what it does is it sets that property to initial if the property is not inherited, and to inherit when the property is inherited. Like if you set font to unset, then it's basically the same as setting font to inherit. If you set background to unset, it's the same as if you set background to initial, which is transparent. The initial value of background is transparent. This is why we get transparent. There is a number of cases where we might end up with a declaration that is invalid at computed value time. One of them we just saw is if the browser cannot understand the value of this property once substitution has happened. Another case is when the property doesn't have a value at all. It's like it's blank. Like blank is a perfectly fine value for a custom property, but eventually, if you end up with a background declaration or any other declaration that doesn't have a value, that is invalid. So again, it's treated as unset. And this is what we saw with the border declaration earlier. If you're using a variable somewhere that doesn't have a value at all, unset, invalid at computed value time. If you actually do set the variable to something, but you're setting it to initial, same, invalid at computed value time. If even a part of if you're setting your declaration to a number of things and there's somewhere in there's a variable that is not set, invalid at computed value time. If you have a cycle, if you have a variable that's referencing another variable and the other variable is referencing your first variable, both of them invalid at computed value time. If you're trying to set the value of a variable based on the same variable, this is not JavaScript. It's a cycle, invalid at computed value time. And also, fallbacks can make variables invalid at computed value time. So this thing keeps coming up, and if you don't know about it, it can trip you up real bad. So you might be wondering, so you just showed us how this doesn't work, how it doesn't work when we try to do fallbacks in the old way and we're using variables. So what works? This works, at supports works. You can set your variable to the fallback and then override it with at supports. And then you get the faded turquoise in Chrome and the very bright turquoise in Safari. And every time someone comes across space toggle, they're like, okay, yeah, haha, that's fun, but like, I cannot use this in production. My teammates would kill me. Or like, I cannot possibly send a pull request with this. Like, they're gonna kick me out of the team. So, like I said, yes, if you think of how space toggle works, it's very confusing. It's like if you try to explain to another developer in your team that they have to use space to toggle something off and initial to turn it on, they're gonna be like, "Are you out of your mind?" But you can actually alias these values to nice readable names like on and off, true and false, yes and no, whatever you want. And then you just use these values throughout. So you have a design system CSS file that sets these values and also uses space toggle on a variety of components, and then you just use these variables by setting them to these constants. And they're all nice and readable. Also, there are much more tame things that you could do with the idea behind space toggle. For example, one of the CSS features I'm very excited about is being able to interpolate in a color space. Like, for the longest time, gradients and general color interpolation in CSS has been stuck with interpolating in sRGB, which produces terrible results. Like, look at this red to green gradient, and we're just used to this. Oh, this is how gradients work. No, gradients do not have to work this way. If we interpolate in a different color space, we can get a nice gradient like this, which today we have to create manually by setting multiple different color stops. And all we have to do to get this is a token in the beginning of the gradient with the color space it interpolates in. However, this token makes our gradient invalid in browsers that don't support this feature yet. So what can we do? We can use at supports and set a gradient and override it. But then we have to specify every gradient twice, which is kind of awful. So what can we do? We can globally set an inLAB token. Notice the comma is important. And then in every gradient we define, we use this, we just use this variable in the beginning. And we only define it once, and this variable resolves to inLAB in browsers that support this feature, and to nothingness in browsers that don't support this feature. And we get nice gradients where we can get nice gradients, and old-style gradients where we can't. And once Chrome implements them, we get nice gradients in Chrome immediately. So space toggle has been taken to quite an extreme by some people. Jane Ori created an entire Minesweeper game by using space toggle, which I thought was kind of both cool and horrifying. And lastly, my favorite part, the bar chart. So what are we going to make in this section? We're going to make a bar chart that looks like this. Each bar has a number specified by a variable, and the number, this number specifies many different things, the height of the bar, the percentage shown on the bar, the color of the bar itself, and it's all done with CSS. So how can we do that? Our starting point may look something like that. At first, we were trying to use percentages because we thought, you know, it's a bar chart, it's showing percentages, I'm going to use percentages. And our CSS looked kind of like that. Because we were using percentages, we could just use the percentage verbatim in the height like this. So our first step was, let's try to display the percentage on the actual bar. And what would you try? Probably something like this. We would use generated content to display the value of P. But nothing happens. Nothing's displayed. Why is nothing displayed? Because percentages in content don't work. Like, that doesn't accept percentage as a value. So then we try something else. Maybe we should use numbers. And of course, then we have to multiply the plain number with a percentage to actually continue getting the proper height, because like plain numbers do not work in the height property. And this actually brings up an important point about using variables. You can always go from a number to something with a unit, either from a number to a percentage, from a number to a length, from a number to a time, from a number to an angle, anything. But when you have something with a unit, you can never go to a number in today's CSS. In the future, you'll be able to divide with 1 and a unit, and you will be able to get a unitless number that you can use elsewhere. But right now, we cannot do that. Right now, this is not valid. So I would advise you, unless you're 100% sure that this is what you need, try to always use pure data in your CSS variables, not CSS values, not values that you can plug into a declaration immediately, because you will probably end up having to you'll probably end up having to convert them down the line, and you won't be able to. So, however, even though we switched to numbers, our number is still not displaying on the bar. And why is that? Because content doesn't accept numbers either. What does content accept? Strings. That is all. Content accepts a number of strings. You can have multiple different strings next to it, but next to each other, but like that is all content accepts, strings. And what we have right now is a number. And we clearly don't want to have to specify our number as a string, because then we also wouldn't be able to do math with it. So what can we do? We want to continue specifying it as a number, definitely, so we can have a nice API, because like the point of this talk is that the API is over everything. Exposing a nice API to other people is very important, even if it means having to have some ugliness internally. So what can we do? We can specify a counter, because counter reset accepts numbers, and then use that counter in content, because the counter function actually gives us strings, and then the percentage is just another string tucked after it. So does this work? As you can see, it works. Content only accepts strings, but you can convert numbers to strings through counter reset. And yes, it's ugly, but it's internal ugliness. But does it really work? Can you look more carefully? Does it work? So it works on A, it works on B, it works on C, it works on D. Does it work on E? What did we get there? We got 0%. Why did we get 0%? Let's look at our numbers. We got 0% because that's the only number that's not an integer. So actually, content, we can use this trick only to convert integers to strings. Counter reset doesn't accept numbers with decimals. So should we just give up and say, okay, this counter trick only works with integers. I guess we can't do anything here. I guess we're going to have to accept 0%, or more realistically, do it with JavaScript. But is there a way to convert a number to an integer in CSS? Could we do that? Is it possible? You know what we could do? what if we use that property to define an integer custom property that only takes integers, and we set its initial value and everything else that we have to set, and then we set that integer property to our actual p property in calc. This is important. And that converts it to an integer. That converts our number to an integer, and then we can use it in counter reset, and then we can use it in counter to actually display it. It just, basically what we've done is that we've managed to round our number in CSS. So we get 84% now, which is not 84.21, but we probably didn't want to display whatever long decimal thing we had there. So you can convert a number to an integer in CSS by assigning it to a property registered as integer inside calc. You can even floor or seal. This is a trick discovered by Anna Tudor. She's brilliant. And yes, this is ugly, but in the future we'll be able to do this properly. There is a round function that is already defined in specs, in CSS values. All we're waiting is for browsers to actually implement it. And even in the even further future, we'll just be able to use a text function or whatever else we call it. The name is still under debate, to actually convert any value to text and display it directly without having to do any of these tricks. And the last piece of the puzzle to finish our bar chart is the color of the bar, which is now fixed. Instead, we want the color to depend on the actual value of p. So how can we do that? The trick is to use separate variables for each component of the color in HSL, and then use these variables, like define these variables as a function of p. As you'll see, we'll set the hue. We should always add a comment next to these kinds of things because it can get confusing. We set the first value, then we add the difference between start and end values multiplied by the percentage of p, the percentage that p is along the end from 0 to 100. And same with lightness. Lightness goes the other way. It actually becomes lower. So first value plus difference of start and end values multiplied by the percentage of p from 0 to 1, which we can just copy. And then we use H and L into an HSL function. And since that saturation is 100% in all cases, we don't actually need a variable for that. And there it is. If you don't believe me that this is dynamic, I can just show you. And notice how it changes color. And you can actually continue going even past, because it's just math. So this is a special case of something called linear mapping. And you might have done this many times sort of ad hoc. But linear mapping is basically anytime you have a number in one range and you want to linearly map it to a number in another range. And there is obviously a mathematical formula of how you can do that. But I don't expect you to remember it by just seeing it on a slide, obviously. So this is why I made an app that does it for you. You can input the name of your variable, you can input your start value, your end value, and it gives you what calc expression you need to map it. But specifically when it comes to color, we're going to get a much nicer way to do this, because this is kind of not great, right? So soon we're going to get a color mix function, that we can use to interpolate between arbitrary colors and arbitrary percentages. And lastly, we can actually use this technique to specify conditionals as well, because you can see conditionals as a special case of a range. We just don't care about any of the values between 0 and 1. But we can still have we can still see a conditional as a range mapping operation where all we care about is what number we get with 0 and what number we get with 1. And we can even specify, we can even alias the else case to a different variable. Like we can have an is foo and an is not foo. And then it kind of reads nicely as well. Like, here's the conditional we saw before with space toggle, and here's how nice it can look with the linear mapping version, which I think is easier to read because you can actually see both values right there. Whereas with space toggle, you have to define the other value through a delta. And that way, we can also do logical operations, not, and, or, XOR, whatever, because like this is just Boolean algebra. So that way, you can use the same variable to control multiple things and essentially create higher level custom properties, which is something that we saw we can't directly do yet, but using this hack, you can. And another point I want to make, so let's take a look at this SVG. We can have a variable to make it easier to specify where the eyes look. And now we can set it to 0 to have the eyes look all the way left, or 1 so that they look all the way right, or 0.5 so that they look all the way to the center, which is much easier to remember than 25 pixels or 75 pixels. But also, this decouples input and output. It doesn't matter anymore how we set this look variable. We can add JavaScript, and the JavaScript could be completely independent of this code example. The JavaScript doesn't need to know about our SVG here. We're just setting some generic JavaScript to set mouse X and mouse Y variables to where our mouse pointer is, completely unrelated to this SVG. And then, after we've done this, we can go into our CSS and set this look variable to the mouse X variable. And now, we control where the eyes look with the mouse. But none of these demos needed to really know about the other. Like, the JavaScript didn't need to know about the SVG. And the SVG, like the CX declaration that is set to look, didn't need to know about the code setting the mouse X and mouse Y variables. And we just connect them through custom properties. So there's another takeaway, that range mapping one range to another range also allows you to decouple input from output, which can be very useful for having maintainable code. And lastly, and I know I'm running a little bit over, but I'm getting there. So you might have enjoyed this, but you might be thinking, yeah, I cannot use this. This is just hacks. This is just a steaming pile of hacks. So yes, there are a lot of hacks shown in this talk, but notice that all of the hacks are so you can expose a nicer API to your, like if you're writing code that will be used by other developers, either as a part of a library or even like within the same team. Notice that all of the hacks are so that you can expose a nicer API to other people. The hacks are in the implementation. And yes, it's nice to have implementation simplicity. It's nice to have beautiful code in your implementation, but it's even more important to have a beautiful API that other people can use without having to look up things in documentation all the time, without having to remember all sorts of things, without getting confused. And sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Sometimes you have to pick between the two, and especially because like CSS today, there's a lot of things it cannot do yet. So sometimes you have to pick, am I going to use a hack in the implementation so that I expose a nicer API? Or am I going to tell people that they have to use obscure values to toggle things, but I have a nicer implementation? Implementation work is always less than the work of using an API, because an API tends to be used by a lot more people. So there's a lot more hours, person hours, that are wasted if an API is difficult to use compared to if an implementation is complex. So I do think that there is value in employing even hacks as ugly as these to expose an API that people love to use. And you just bear the burden of working on the implementation, on an implementation that is a little bit confusing, and you just document it, and there are ways to have a nicer implementation and to make the implementation easier to understand, through commenting and documentation, that sort of thing. But like, I think exposing a nice API should be the topmost goal. This is not a license to write bad code. It's just that sometimes you have to make tough decisions. And you can't always have everything. You can't always have your cake and eat it too. And I think the priority lies with having a nicer API. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah. That's okay, you don't have to plug it out. Would you like to join me for a little conversation?
Of course, yes.
There are so many questions. Are you ready for this?
Of course.
Oh, wow, I think we have like 27 questions here, but we won't go through all of them, of course. One thing that came up quite a lot is, and this is actually very much ties neatly with what you're saying in the very end. This is one thing that was actually quite highlighted here. So I often have the impression with CSS that for things that are that are at most intermediate in JavaScript with 2 lines, you would need advanced wizardry in CSS and deep knowledge to achieve the same thing. Is it right or is it wrong?
So for things like yes. First off, yes, this is correct. And I don't think it's a valuable goal to try to do things in CSS when you can do them with 2 lines of JavaScript and they are equally
Performant, I guess.
It's not just about performance. Like if you get the same API by using JavaScript, if you can expose an equally nice API to your users, to other people by using JavaScript, by all means go for it. But since right now we do not have a JavaScript API to monitor changes to CSS properties, you couldn't do the things we saw in this talk by using JavaScript. Like unless you wanted to poll, unless you wanted to check what the value of glossy, for example, was every few milliseconds and change things, but that would be very slow. Like we don't have a proper style observer or anything like that to observe changes to a custom property and apply different things. If we did, yes, doing it with JavaScript might be easier. But right now, we cannot have JavaScript that is equally reactive in that way. Like we cannot have JavaScript that enables people to just change custom properties and have presentational changes to their component.
Yeah, but we also have these conversations, for example, when you think about navigation, the hamburger menus, things like that. Sometimes you'll have conversations about, well, we could do this with just a few lines of JavaScript, or we could do it with CSS. And then the question comes up, okay, so what should we do? And often, oh, you would like to answer that? I can see that.
I think you should use the language that makes things easier for everyone. But like, sometimes we think that we can do it easier with JavaScript, but the JavaScript doesn't allow us to do it in an equally reactive way. Like CSS is a reactive language. You set a variable somewhere, it changes everywhere that references it. To do that with JavaScript, like without a library of some sort, there's a lot of logic involved usually. Like you have to think of all the possible cases that might change this condition and apply the changes and like monitor for anything that could potentially change that value. So it's often not as simple as it seems at first to do it with JavaScript. But when it is, yes, totally, use the right tool for the job. I also see people doing like illustration-like things with CSS. And I'm like, why? Like, we have a separate language for this. We have SVG for that sort of thing. Like, I don't think that you should try to contort CSS to do things that CSS was not made to do.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a goal in itself.
But sometimes you can do it because, you know, you can.
Yeah, if you're doing it for fun, that's a separate question.
If it's a side project that you kind of want to do, that's fine.
Totally. If you're doing it for fun, yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. So, many more questions. First, styling select menus and radio buttons. Are we making any progress there?
There is. Were you not here when Yuna was speaking yesterday?
Yeah, but we have accent color, right? But if you want to have something...
No, not accent color. The last bit, the select menu
Oh,
element.
yes, of course.
So that is going to allow us to have styled pop-up menus. I mean, it's still very experimental.
Yes.
But yes, there's a lot of work in OpenUI in designing this stylable select menu. For radio buttons, I'm not aware of anything, but radio buttons are easier to style. Like, you can just hide them and use the checked pseudo class.
Yeah. Okay. What's the state of CSS Houdini at this point? Is it going to become the thing which is kind of supported everywhere? Like, because it's like a bigger spec, right?
So different API, Houdini is not a spec. Houdini is a set of different specs, and they have different levels of maturity. I mean, technically, @property that I showed you is a part of Houdini. And I think that's probably the most mature part of Houdini right now. Like, it's being implemented in Safari. Firefox will eventually follow. Right now, Firefox is very short for resources, but it is eventually going to implement it. Whereas, like, there are other things, like the parser API, which is like super far into the future. Like, they have very different levels of maturity. It's a set of like 6 or 7 or 8 specs.
Right. There are 2 people who are very excited, and they even bolded the the question here, so I really have to bring it up. What about language hyphenation?
You can do that.
Yeah, but with hyphens auto, isn't it only English that's really
No,
properly? No,
you
it's-
just have to set the language in your HTML, like lang equals whatever language code you want, and you have hyphenation in that language.
Okay, okay. We have, okay, so here's one more. Do linters strip up our spaces used in this way? Like space toggle, the space toggle that you have covered?
Can you repeat that question?
Do linters strip up our spaces used in this
So
way?
even if they do, actually not having a value is now valid as well. When space toggle first was invented, you had to use a space because just having an empty custom property value was invalid. But right now, even doing like custom property colon, semicolon, like not having anything as the value, that is valid as well now. So it doesn't even matter. Like linters and minifiers and whatever can decide to throw the space away completely, and space toggle still works.
Okay.
I guess it's just an unfortunate name in that case.
Yes, probably, yes.
Empty toggle.
Empty toggle would be better. Yes. It seems like there is a lot of complexity moving from JavaScript to CSS. So much can be done with CSS alone these days. So is it the direction where we're heading? Should we be expecting nesting, mixins, and everything we used to love from Sass in CSS?
Absolutely. Actually, there's a lot of work right now in nesting. There are browsers, both Firefox and Chrome, are implementing nesting right now. It's held back because we are making some changes to the syntax. We're exploring if we can make the syntax closer to Sass, because I don't know if you're familiar with native CSS nesting. It's not super close to Sass. It was inspired from it, but right now the current version of the syntax that you can use with PostCSS requires an ampersand with every rule. Even descendants and everything, like you have to have the ampersand there. And in some cases where the ampersand comes later in the selector, you also have to use @nest. So it's a lot of visual noise, a lot of quite a hassle to type. You have to remember a lot of things. So we're exploring how we can simplify that syntax. And like, we need your help there, because like it seems that there's two camps of people, and I'm quite worried how we're going to get consensus there, because there is one camp of people that think that every nested rule should have an ampersand because that makes things clearer. And there's another group of people that think we should try to get as close as possible to Sass and not require an ampersand when it can be inferred, like, descendants, child selectors, that sort of thing. Obviously, you need an ampersand in some cases, like when you're styling variations of the root. But like, there's a lot of people that think we should try to be as concise as possible, not require it always. And these are completely at odds. Like one group thinks it should be mandatory, the other group thinks it should be optional. How do you get everyone to be happy?
So I'm wondering also at this point, so where does it leave Sass? So for example, do you see Sass just being obsolete in a couple of years? Or will it be kind of used for different purposes?
Sass might have gotten obsolete if it stopped developing, but preprocessors will always be testing ground for new CSS features. And also, like, there's a lot of features in Sass that I don't see us adding to CSS anytime soon. Like, for example, loops. But then again, I don't want to make like big proclamations we're never going to add loops to CSS, because like for many things that are being added to CSS now, if you asked people in the CSS working group 10 years ago, they would say, no, this is never going to be a part of CSS. Like parent selectors, for example. Everybody that requested parent selectors used to be told, no, we cannot do this in CSS. Absolutely not, never. It's too slow, O(n) squared. You cannot do this in CSS. And look at that. Now we're getting Has that does exactly this and more. So, but like, there's always going to be things in preprocessors that CSS doesn't implement. Because when CSS, even if CSS implements loops that are in Sass today, what will Sass support by then? Like, Sass continues evolving too.
Sure.
CSS could never evolve with the same speed as a third-party tool.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, there's a wonderful question that I absolutely have to bring up. When you look at a clear blue sky, do you construct the gradient of blue from above to the horizon?
Right now, we can only use sRGB colors in CSS because only Safari supports colors outside sRGB, so you can't actually represent these beautiful colors that you see out there.
I see.
So maybe
That's a
once
perfect
Chrome
answer.
implements wide gamut colors, maybe then.
Okay, that's a great answer indeed. Another question that came up as well, with such an in-depth knowledge of code, do you still encounter imposter syndrome in your work?
Absolutely. Like, you know when Vitaly was introducing me, and one of the facts that he mentioned was she's bad at CSS layout? That was not a joke. I am bad at CSS layout. Every time I do layout, I am puzzled at how things work. Like every time I use grid or flexbox, maybe not every time, but like so many times, I'm like puzzled at like why is this not being sized the way I want, and like why do when I shrink this, it's not shrinking the way I expect, and like it's not easy for me either.
Yeah, can you make me feel a bit comfortable? Yeah. So when it comes to centering a div or so, just so I feel comfortable.
Come on,
so
I know you know how to center a div
I
these
think
days.
I do, yes. But I mean, when it comes to like with Flexbox or with Grid, do you also go through the justify content or line items to check them all off? Just to
Yes.
make okay, so it's not just me.
Yeah, I can never remember like which way it is.
I can never remember either. So that's like this makes it at least two of us. I think maybe like 300, two of us as well. That's great. There's also just one question that came up, which is probably a bit more about CSS Working Group and how it operates. Can you share more about how the CSS Working Group operates and how web developers can keep up to date with proposed changes or even influence it?
So the way the CSS Working Group operates is we have a GitHub repo. It's open to the public. You can find it under w3c/csswg-drafts. I don't expect you to remember a URL like that, but like if you Google it, it'll probably come up. Like if you Google CSS Working Group GitHub repo. And everything is discussed in that repo basically. Sometimes the language might be a little technical, there's certain terminology, but like all of our discussions are public like that. We have telcons once a week, every Wednesday, and we discuss certain issues that are tagged Agenda Plus from the repo. The minutes, even though the telcon is not open to the public, the minutes from that discussion are posted to the relevant GitHub issue. There's a bot that tracks which GitHub issue its discussion is for and publishes it in the relevant GitHub issue. So when you look at each GitHub issue, it contains like all of the discussion and decisions, whether they happened in the repo or whether they happened in a telcon. And also we have face-to-face meetings about 3 to 4 times a year before COVID. Now they're a bit slower. So now we do more of them virtually, but we've started having face-to-face meetings as well. And again, same as the telcons, the meetings from those meetings, the minutes from these meetings are posted on each GitHub issue, so you can see like all of the discussion there. I mean, sometimes it might, if you want to participate, sometimes it might make sense to like read a few issues first and like see the way discussions are conducted, the sort of terminology used, because like it's easier to get heard in general in a community, like when you follow the conventions of that community. But yeah, all our work is public.
Yeah, but you know what? One thing that really surprises me that it's just a group of people. It's a very small group of people. How many people are working in CSS Working Group?
I would say the active participants are like maybe 15 people. What would you say, Chris? 40 or 50. The active people that participate in telcons and meetings and all of that? 25? Okay, yeah, about that. But the members of the CSS Working Group officially, I think, are about 80.
Yeah. Small question that came up just now. Could you share the tool that you're using for this presentation to show live changes?
It's not very well documented, but it's a combination of tools that I've written. The slide framework is called Inspire.js, and you can find it at inspirejs.org. It's on GitHub too. Not very well documented. The documentation is a work in progress, but yeah. And the live coding, I actually wrote this year for. I was teaching this class at MIT, and I was asked, you know, it has all these live coding demos, and it requires you to be taught. And like, if you leave or stop teaching this class, like, how are we going to teach this class? And I'm like, okay, I don't want to remove the live coding demos, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to script myself. So I wrote this library called Rety, R-E-T-Y, also on GitHub, that allows you to basically record yourself record yourself coding, basically record yourself typing in any text area or input or whatever, anything that is compatible with the API it expects, anything that fires input events with an input type, basically. And it creates a JSON script that you can then play back on any other text area that you want. And then I've written a plugin for Inspire.js that uses Rety to replay these scripts.
Okay. Well, the last question, I guess, and then we're probably running out of time. There are so many more. So if you have any questions to Leah, I'm sure that you'll be also available after the next session, next to this coffee area. So you can ask all questions that, on CSS or not. But one thing that came up is, how do you feel about CSS and JS styled components, etc.?
I think developers are trying to find solutions for the problems where the web platform is not for the problems where the web platform is not offering them a decent solution, and CSS and JS came out of that. I think the web standards community should sort of take a close look to why developers are using these practices and try to solve the actual problems that these practices are trying to solve. Because right now, CSS is failing developers. This is why they're doing these things. And work on fixing these problems is, in some cases, non-existent, and in other cases, very slow. But I do strongly believe that eventually we're going to go into a future where these kinds of things will not be needed, because web platform technologies like CSS, JavaScript by itself, HTML will solve these problems.
Right. And finally, if you had to pick one dream feature that you wanted CSS maybe to have eventually, I mean, you're working on all those little things and all these little possibilities that we have now with CSS and all. Is there like one of your favorites? The one that you're really excited about? Whatever is, maybe haven't been working on yet, or whatever is coming up next?
Many, but does that involve features that are specified in a specification and not implemented
not
yet, or not specified at all?
Anything.
Can there be discussions about it and just no specification?
Sure.
I would love a function that lets you reference the value of any other property, even if it means realistically that will never happen in that form. But there is a resolution to have a function that lets you reference the value of any other property on the parent, and that is still very useful. And it does solve a lot of these use cases. Conditionals also, I would really love conditionals. I mentioned this would be a JavaScript feature, but I wish we had a way to listen to changes to CSS properties that would let you create so much better components. When writing web components, I've needed this so frequently, some way to monitor change values to value changes. Gosh, I cannot speak today. To CSS properties.
Very well today. So many things on the horizon as well, many things that are to be excited about. Well, with this in mind, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and all the things here. Leah, everyone. Thank you, Leah.